You're watching an empire bleed money in slow motion, and almost no one at the time fully understood what was happening. In 1939, Britain entered World War II as the most powerful empire on Earth. It controlled nearly a quarter of the planet, commanded the seas, and had ruled global finance for over a century. London was still the heart of international money. The pound sterling was still a world currency. Britain had won world wars before. On paper, this looked like just another fight it would survive. But this war was different. From the very first months, Britain was burning through resources at a pace it had never experienced. Every plane shot down had to be replaced. Every ship sunk meant steel, labor, fuel, and time. And unlike previous wars, this one was global, industrial, and brutally expensive. Britain wasn't just fighting Germany. It was fighting arithmetic. Here's the problem you were never taught to look at. Britain could fight. Britain could command. But Britain could no longer pay. Before the war, Britain imported enormous amounts of food, oil, machinery, and raw materials. It paid for those imports using overseas investments and gold reserves accumulated over generations. By 1939, those reserves looked impressive, but war turns reserves into smoke. Every month, Britain was paying the United States hundreds of millions of dollars for weapons, trucks, aircraft, fuel, and food. And America demanded payment in cash. Not promises, not future favors. Cash. This was called cash and carry. If Britain wanted American supplies, it had to pay immediately and transport them itself. At first, Britain accepted the terms. It had no choice. Germany controlled much of Europe's industry, and American factories were the only place that could produce what Britain needed at scale. So Britain paid. It sold off overseas assets. It liquidated investments. It shipped gold across the Atlantic in secret convoys. Gold that had been accumulated during the height of empire was now flowing into American vaults, bar by bar. You need to pause here, because this is a turning point. Empires don't collapse when they lose battles. They collapse when they lose financial leverage. And Britain was losing it fast. By 1940, something remarkable happened. The British government realized it was running out of money, not metaphorically, literally. Officials calculated that at the current burn rate, Britain would be unable to pay the United States within months. No dollars meant no weapons. No weapons meant defeat. This is when Britain went to Washington, not as an equal partner, but as a desperate buyer. And Washington knew it. Franklin D. Roosevelt publicly framed America as the arsenal of democracy. Privately, American officials understood that this war offered something no previous conflict had: the chance to replace Britain as the financial center of the world. The solution they proposed sounded generous. It was called Lend-Lease. The story you were taught is simple. America saved its allies by lending them weapons. But that's not how power works. And that's not how the agreement was structured. Under Lend-Lease, the United States would provide Britain with weapons, ships, aircraft, food, fuel, and industrial equipment without immediate payment. That was the headline. That was the sales pitch. The fine print told a different story. Nothing was free. Britain had to agree to conditions that reached far beyond the battlefield. It had to open its markets after the war. It had to dismantle imperial trade preferences that had protected British industry for decades. It had to share technological secrets. And most importantly, it had to accept that the post-war financial system would be shaped in Washington, not London. This wasn't charity. It was leverage. Think of it like this. Britain was trading the future of its empire for survival in the present. By 1941, Britain was no longer paying in gold. It was paying in influence. Every shipment of American equipment deepened its dependence. Every month of survival pushed Britain further away from financial independence. And the numbers were staggering. By the end of the war, Britain had received over $31 billion worth of goods under Lend-Lease. Adjusted for inflation, that's hundreds of billions today. Meanwhile, Britain's overseas investments, once the backbone of its wealth, had been sold, surrendered, or consumed. The empire was winning battles, but losing the balance sheet. What made this even more brutal is that Lend-Lease didn't end when the war did. In 1945, with almost no warning, the United States abruptly terminated the program. Ships carrying supplies were stopped mid-ocean. Orders were canceled. Britain, exhausted and bankrupt, was suddenly expected to stand on its own again. And now the bill came due. Britain had to negotiate a massive post-war loan from the United States just to survive peacetime. That loan came with conditions that forced Britain to make the pound convertible to dollars, a decision that triggered a financial crisis almost immediately. Sterling collapsed, capital fled, and Britain lost control over its own currency in a way it never fully recovered from. This is the part that history books often. Lend-Lease didn't just help defeat Nazi Germany. It quietly dismantled the British Empire's economic foundation. It shifted global power from London to New York. It replaced the pound with the dollar. It turned Britain from a world banker into a debtor nation. By the time victory celebrations filled the streets, the war had already been lost in another arena. The battlefield you never see in movies. The one that decides who writes the rules afterward. And Britain had already surrendered there. The empire didn't collapse overnight. It unraveled slowly, country by country, decade by decade. But the moment it became financially dependent on the United States, the outcome was locked in. By the time the United States entered the war directly after Pearl Harbor, the relationship between Britain and America had already been fundamentally reshaped. Britain was no longer a senior partner. It was a client. And in power politics, clients don't set terms. American policymakers understood something crucial. Wars don't just destroy enemies. They reorganize hierarchies. The question wasn't whether Britain would survive the war. The real question was what kind of Britain would emerge afterward. Before the war, the British Empire operated on a closed economic system. Colonies were expected to trade primarily with Britain. Raw materials flowed in. Finished goods flowed out. The system favored British industry and kept the pound strong. This imperial preference was one of the last pillars holding Britain's global power together. Lend-Lease targeted that pillar directly. Quietly, through clauses and side agreements, the United States pushed Britain to accept a future of free trade. That phrase sounds neutral, even fair. But free trade between an industrial giant and an exhausted empire isn't neutral. It's asymmetrical. American industry was expanding. British industry was worn down by bombing, labor shortages, and debt. When Britain agreed to abandon imperial trade barriers, it was agreeing to compete on American terms. At the same time, the United States was absorbing more than just gold and assets. It was absorbing knowledge. British radar technology, jet engine research, nuclear physics, industrial techniques. These were shared under wartime cooperation. On the surface, this looked like alliance behavior. In reality, it accelerated America's technological leap, while Britain lacked the capital to commercialize its own innovations. The war was turning Britain into a research lab and America into the manufacturer. Meanwhile, British leaders had almost no room to maneuver. The German threat was existential. Losing American support wasn't an option. Every negotiation happened under pressure. Every concession was justified as temporary. But temporary concessions have a way of becoming permanent realities. By 1943, the writing was already on the wall. American planners were designing the post-war financial system. Britain was invited to the table, but not to lead. The Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 formalized what Lend-Lease had already accomplished informally. The dollar would be the center of the global monetary system. Currencies would peg themselves to the dollar. The dollar would be backed by gold. International institutions would be headquartered and influenced by the United States. This was presented as stability, and it was just not for Britain. For the first time in modern history, London was no longer the axis of global finance. New York was. Britain's problem was structural. It had debts denominated in dollars, a weakened industrial base, and a currency that people no longer trusted. Maintaining the empire under those conditions was mathematically impossible. Empires require surplus. Britain had deficits. After the war ended, the illusion of partnership collapsed quickly. The United States, now the world's dominant creditor, had no interest in propping up imperial systems that restricted American access to global markets. Decolonization wasn't just moral rhetoric, it was economic logic. As colonies gained independence, they were encouraged to trade freely, borrow in dollars, and integrate into the American-led system. Britain lost captive markets. It lost guaranteed resource flows. And it lost geopolitical leverage almost everywhere it had once ruled. None of this happened with tanks or invasions. It happened with balance sheets. At home, the consequences were severe. Britain introduced austerity. Rationing continued years after victory. Living standards stagnated. The public was told the country had won the war but lost the peace. That wasn't poetic exaggeration. It was financial reality. Even decades later, Britain was still paying for decisions made during Lend-Lease. The final repayment on wartime loans wasn't completed until the early 21st century. An empire that once lent money to the world spent generations paying interest. This is why Lend-Lease matters beyond World War II. It's a case study in how power actually shifts, not through conquest, but through dependency, not through collapse, but through agreements made under stress. When survival is on the line, long-term costs become invisible. And this pattern didn't end with Britain. The same logic would later be applied across the world. Nations facing crisis would receive help on conditions. Those conditions would reshape their economies, their currencies, their politics. The language would change. The mechanism would not. Lend-Lease was a prototype. Britain believed it was buying time. What it was really doing was selling the future structure of its power. By the time the war ended, the empire still existed on maps, but the engine that sustained it was gone. This is the uncomfortable truth most histories avoid. Britain didn't simply decline because the world changed. It declined because it made rational decisions under extreme pressure, and those decisions locked in a new global order. The war ended in 1945, but the transfer of power had already been completed. And once financial gravity shifts, it never moves back easily. By 1945, Britain was officially victorious, yet its streets were still rationed, its factories damaged, its currency unstable. Victory parades had a deeper loss, one invisible on maps and battlefields, but etched into every bank ledger, every trade agreement, every colony that began whispering about independence. The empire looked intact. It wasn't. The machinery of global power had quietly shifted across the Atlantic. Lend-Lease didn't end with the surrender of Germany or Japan. In practice, it transitioned into post-war financial leverage. Britain owed billions. The war payments and debts, framed as temporary or manageable, became the scaffolding for American influence. Washington now dictated terms: markets, reconstruction, trade routes, loans. Britain was reduced to negotiating survival. Every concession it had made under duress during the war became binding in a new peacetime world. This financial dependency had psychological effects as well. The British ruling class had long prided itself on independence, on the ability to dictate global terms. The empire's collapse was not sudden, but its leaders felt powerless in a way that battles and losses of territory never induced. Every negotiation with Washington reinforced a reality that Britain's global weight had been replaced by American dollars and industrial might. Let's consider India, the jewel in Britain's crown. India had financed much of Britain's war effort, providing troops, resources, and revenue. After the war, Britain could no longer enforce colonial trade preferences without American scrutiny. Dollar loans and Lend-Lease obligations made continued extraction politically and economically impossible. Indian independence in 1947 was not just a political inevitability. It was a financial one. Britain simply lacked the resources to maintain its grip. Meanwhile, the narrative in Britain remained patriotic and triumphant, glossing over the financial erosion. Newspapers celebrated military heroics. School children learned of bravery at Dunkirk, the Battle of Britain, and the defeat of Hitler. Yet the economic context, the invisible extraction of wealth, the surrender of monetary autonomy, was absent, and that absence shaped public perception. Victory felt total, but the foundation had already shifted. The dollar replaced the pound. British banks had to compete globally in a world structured around New York. Sterling reserves shrank dramatically. London's centuries-old position as the world's financial hub was irreversibly weakened. Investments that had once funded empires now fueled American industry. Lend-Lease had been framed as an emergency measure, but it achieved far more. It reordered global finance, redistributing the levers of power without a single shot being fired directly for that purpose. And here's a critical point. Lend-Lease wasn't simply a matter of economics. It was strategic imperial replacement. By making Britain dependent on American supply lines and loans, Washington ensured that the post-war order would favor itself. The world didn't just shift economically, it shifted politically. Britain's global influence contracted, while American influence expanded. Even Europe's reconstruction tells the same story. The Marshall Plan, often portrayed as generous aid, mirrored the principles of Lend-Lease, assistance tied to long-term dependency and economic alignment with American interests. Britain was both a recipient and a precedent. Its weakened state justified American oversight in Reconstruction, establishing norms that would persist into the Cold War. At the domestic level, the impact was immediate and tangible. Britain continued rationing, cut back on social spending, and struggled to pay off debts for decades. Every pound borrowed from Washington came with a cost in policy flexibility. Domestic austerity reinforced the empire's decline. Britain could no longer maintain military presence or invest in colonial infrastructure at pre-war levels. Financial subordination translated into diminished global projection. This wasn't a subtle transformation. It was structural. Lend-Lease created a system where Britain could fight and survive in the short term, but lost control of its post-war destiny. The American economy, bolstered by wartime production, surged. Industrial dominance, combined with control over global liquidity through the dollar, ensured that America dictated global terms. Britain was now a junior partner in every sense, dependent, constrained, and financially subordinated. Think about the psychology of this for a moment. British officials entered wartime negotiations believing they were securing survival. Each shipment, each agreement, each loan felt like a lifeline. What they didn't fully see was that every lifeline was a tether. And once a nation becomes tethered financially, its freedom to act independently shrinks rapidly. Military success could not compensate for financial subjugation. The empire was fighting on the wrong battlefield. And yet, the popular narrative stayed simple. Britain had won the war. It had defeated Hitler. It had liberated Europe. But Lend-Lease ensured that Britain would not wield the same power afterward. Military victory had a hollow ring. On the global stage, the war had been won with bullets, but the real conquest had been financial, and the conqueror was America. By the late 1940s, Britain's empire was cracking faster than many realized. Currency controls, debt repayments, and reduced military spending all accelerated decolonization. Lend-Lease had created conditions where maintaining colonies was economically untenable. Even strategic interests, such as bases and trade hubs, were renegotiated under financial pressure. The empire's unraveling was inevitable. It had been quietly financed into submission. And here's the final piece of the picture. Lend-Lease wasn't just a wartime expedient. It was a blueprint. America demonstrated that financial leverage could replace direct conquest. Weapons, loans, and conditional aid could reshape empires without the need for occupation. Britain, exhausted and dependent, became the first case study of this new form of economic imperialism. The battlefield had shifted from Europe to the global ledger. This is why Lend-Lease remains controversial in historical hindsight. On the surface, it was heroic, benevolent, aiding allies against tyranny. But beneath the surface, it was strategic, calculated, and transformative. Britain survived physically, but its independence and financial supremacy were gone forever. And by the time the public celebrated victory parades, the empire had already lost its freedom. By the early 1950s, Britain's financial position remained fragile. Its pre-war assets, foreign investments, gold reserves, and overseas trade dominance had been depleted, much of it during the Lend-Lease years. London, once the nerve center of global finance, was now competing against New York in a world structured to favor the dollar. The empire's prestige remained, but the machinery that sustained it had been dismantled piece by piece. Every month, Britain had to allocate scarce resources to debt repayment, leaving less for domestic rebuilding or maintaining military presence overseas. Strategic decisions that might have been made from strength were now made from necessity. When Britain negotiated with other nations, it was forced to accommodate American interests first. The empire's autonomy had eroded invisibly, yet irrevocably. Across the globe, the consequences were clear. Colonial markets that had once been captive were now open to American goods. Raw materials were still flowing outward, but profits increasingly favored U.S. companies and financial institutions. Britain could no longer control the terms of trade. Its manufacturing sector, still recovering from wartime bombing and disruption, faced competition without preferential protection. The economic engine that had fueled centuries of empire was faltering. India is the most obvious example. While nationalist movements had been growing for decades, Britain's weakened post-war position made maintaining control economically and militarily impractical. Independence in 1947 was accelerated not just by political pressure, but by financial incapacity. The empire could no longer afford to enforce its authority through coercion or subsidies. The very colonies that had sustained Britain through 2 world wars were slipping away, in part because the empire had mortgaged its future to survive the present. Lend-Lease, in retrospect, was a masterstroke of strategic influence. It ensured that Britain survived the war, but it also guaranteed that the post-war order would favor the United States. Weapons and supplies were the apparent exchange, but the hidden currency was control over Britain's finances, markets, and global position. Every shipment deepened dependency. Every loan constrained policy. By the time the guns fell silent, Britain was already structurally subordinate to Washington. The British public remained largely unaware. Newspapers celebrated the end of wartime rationing, the return of soldiers, and the triumph over Hitler. The psychological impact of visible victory masked the slow extraction of power happening through invisible ledgers and trade agreements. Citizens cheered while the empire's financial autonomy was quietly dismantled. Lend-Lease became an invisible battlefield, won by balance sheets rather than bullets. The broader lesson is clear. Power doesn't always shift through force alone. Wars can be won on the battlefield, while losing in the vaults. Britain's experience shows how strategic lending, conditional aid, and financial leverage can restructure global hierarchies. Lend-Lease was more than a survival program. It was a deliberate tool of influence, reshaping the world while maintaining the appearance of generosity and alliance. Meanwhile, Britain's domestic economy struggled to adjust. Manufacturing was constrained by debt and competition. Infrastructure was in disrepair, and the government faced years of austerity. Social programs, housing, and public services were delayed or reduced. The nation that had once dictated terms globally was now forced to prioritize loan repayments over domestic prosperity. The financial chain linking Britain to Washington influenced every policy decision. At the same time, the United States consolidated its position. Dollar dominance was reinforced. American companies expanded into former imperial markets, and global financial institutions were structured to favor Washington's influence. Lend-Lease had done more than save Britain. It had created a new global order. The economic rules now favored the lender over the debtor, shaping international relations for decades to come. For the British government, the reality was stark. Survival in the war had been achieved at the cost of independence. Military victory could not undo financial subordination. The empire could no longer function as it had. Its colonies would demand autonomy. Trade agreements would favor foreign powers, and the pound would never again dominate global finance. Lend-Lease had set the stage for a post-war world in which Britain was important, but no longer supreme. By the time Britain fully repaid its wartime debts in the early 21st century, the empire had long since vanished. The lessons of Lend-Lease remained. Strategic loans, conditional aid, and financial leverage are as powerful as armies, and survival under duress can come at the cost of long-term sovereignty. The war had ended, but the quiet conquest of Britain's economic independence had already been completed. The empire's decline wasn't visible in parades or monuments, but in balance sheets, trade flows, and currency exchanges. The battlefield had moved from Europe to the global economy, and Britain, once dominant, had already lost the fight. And yet, the story of Lend-Lease teaches something broader. Power in the modern world is often invisible. It moves through contracts, loans, and currencies rather than through ships and soldiers. Britain survived the fire war only to find itself bound by the chains of financial dependency, a lesson that echoes through history and into the modern era. The moment Britain stepped off the battlefield, it faced a new kind of war, one fought not with bombs, but with numbers. Every decision, every policy, every negotiation was now constrained by dollars it owed, agreements it signed, and obligations it could not escape. Lend-lease, which had once seemed like a lifeline, had become a tether. Factories that had once produced for empire now competed in a global market designed to favor American industry. Raw materials, once controlled through imperial trade policies, were now subject to international pricing and American corporate interests. Britain's influence over its own economic future was diminished, almost imperceptibly at first, but with every passing year, the dependence deepened. This dependency reshaped British politics as well. Leaders had to consider not just domestic priorities, but also how every move would be perceived in Washington. Policy independence, once taken for granted, became a negotiation tactic with a far more powerful partner. The irony was bitter. Britain had fought a total war to preserve its sovereignty, only to find that financial obligations impose a more subtle but no less binding control. Across the empire, the consequences were equally clear. Colonies that had been forced into wartime production now expected political autonomy. British administrators, already stretched thin, could not maintain both domestic reconstruction and imperial oversight. Independence movements gained momentum in India, Africa, and the Caribbean, accelerated not by sudden political awakening alone, but by the practical reality that Britain lacked the resources to enforce imperial rule. The dollar's rise as the central currency of global finance cemented this shift. Sterling, once a symbol of global reach, became a secondary currency. London, the hub of global banking for centuries, had to adapt to a world where decisions were increasingly made in New York. International lending, trade agreements, and even reconstruction efforts now flowed through Washington, and Britain was rarely in a position to dictate terms. Lend-lease had reshaped the very architecture of global power. The personal costs were visible at home. Rationing continued long after victory celebrations. Housing shortages, economic stagnation, and austerity became the everyday reality for ordinary citizens. The narrative of victory masked the financial erosion. While the public celebrated triumphs abroad, the empire's financial foundation quietly crumbled, leaving Britain in a state of prolonged recovery that lasted decades. Perhaps the most insidious effect was psychological. For generations, Britain had believed itself invincible, a nation whose reach and influence were unquestionable. Lend-lease revealed a different truth. Survival required surrender, and the surrender was financial. It was invisible, slow, and complete. Military victory had been achieved, but independence in the economic and geopolitical sense had been ceded. Even international institutions reflected this shift. Bretton Woods, IMF, and the World Bank, all structures emerging from the war, favored American priorities and practices. Britain participated, but always as a junior partner. Its influence existed, but it was no longer decisive. Lend-lease had not just supplied weapons. It had subtly redirected the rules of global governance. The empire's unraveling continued through the 1950s and 1960s. The British pound remained under pressure. Colonies gained independence, and global markets adjusted to favor the new superpower. Every strategic decision had to account for financial realities imposed decades earlier during the war. Survival had been purchased at the cost of autonomy, and the cost was permanent. Yet, Lend-lease also left a lesson that is often overlooked. Power in the modern era is not solely determined by armies or territory. It is determined by finance, by control over resources, by the ability to shape dependency. America had mastered this. Britain, even as it retained symbolic dominance, had been caught in a transaction that ensured a new hierarchy for generations. By the time Britain repaid its wartime debts, the geopolitical landscape had already shifted irreversibly. Europe's reconstruction, the rise of American hegemony, the independence of former colonies, all were consequences of the invisible financial war that had begun under the guise of Lend-lease. The empire's visible triumphs masked a deeper defeat, one that would shape the modern world in ways still felt today. Lend-lease, framed as aid, had been the mechanism for a quiet transfer of global authority. Britain had survived, yes, but at a cost so profound it reshaped history. And this is the part of the story that textbooks rarely tell. Victory on the battlefield can coexist with the loss of strategic power, and the currency of influence is often dollars, not firepower. The empire endured physically, but financially and strategically, it had been subdued. And once that subjugation began, it unfolded across decades, quietly, methodically, reshaping the modern world order without a single shot fired in that arena. By the late 1950s, the full consequences of Lend-Lease were impossible to ignore. Britain's once mighty empire was now a patchwork of independent nations, each pursuing their own economic and political interests. The colonies that had been instrumental in sustaining Britain through 2 world wars were free to trade, borrow, and govern themselves. Britain had survived the war, but its influence over these territories had been irreversibly reduced. Financial dependence on the United States shaped nearly every major policy decision. Sterling's instability forced Britain to rely on dollar loans and international credit. Each loan came with conditions, explicit or implied, that further constrained policy autonomy. Defense spending, social welfare programs, and industrial investment had to be weighed against the necessity of maintaining favorable relations with Washington. Lend-Lease had transformed into a long-term mechanism of leverage. At the global level, the dollar replaced the pound as the anchor of international finance. New York became the financial capital of the world, and London's influence shrank accordingly. International institutions created during and after the war, from the International Monetary Fund to World Bank, were dominated by American priorities and frameworks. Britain, once the architect of global economic order, was now largely a participant in a system designed by others. The transformation was not only structural but cultural. For centuries, Britain had projected power through its empire, currency, and trade dominance. After Lend-Lease, its power projection became reactive rather than proactive. Policy debates increasingly revolved around what the Americans will allow rather than what Britain wants. Military interventions, foreign aid, and trade negotiations were all conducted under the shadow of financial dependency. Lend-Lease also set a precedent for the post-war world. Aid and loans could be used strategically to restructure global hierarchies. The Marshall Plan, the establishment of NATO, and even post-colonial economic programs echoed the mechanisms first employed during World War II. America had demonstrated that it could achieve influence and control without direct conquest, using finance as a tool of power. Britain had been the first and most consequential case study. Domestically, the legacy of Lend-Lease was equally profound. Britain endured a decade of austerity, rationing, and slow economic growth. Infrastructure rebuilding was delayed, housing shortages persisted, and public services struggled under limited budgets. The population had won the war, but in peacetime, they faced the consequences of financial subordination. Every pound spent was, in effect, paying for survival during the war and for the right to remain autonomous afterward. The psychological dimension cannot be understated. Lend-Lease had forced British policymakers to confront an uncomfortable reality. Survival required dependence. Decisions that felt temporary and pragmatic during wartime became structural in the post-war era. The empire could not operate on pre-war assumptions. Power had shifted, and Britain had ceded its independence without ever firing a shot in this new arena. Even Britain's attempt to maintain global influence in the 1950s and 1960s were shaped by financial constraints. Military interventions, from the Suez Crisis to East of Suez deployments, were expensive and increasingly unsustainable. Britain's declining economic clout limited its ability to act unilaterally, further reinforcing the structural shift initiated by Lend-Lease. And yet, the British public narrative remained focused on victory and resilience. Stories of wartime heroism and moral triumph dominated culture and education, while the invisible transformation of global power remained largely unacknowledged. The truth was that Britain's capacity to dictate terms, to act independently, and to leverage its empire had been quietly curtailed. Lend-Lease had ensured that the post-war world favored a new hegemon. By the 1960s, the empire's contraction was irreversible. The financial and political consequences of wartime dependence had set Britain on a trajectory toward diminished global influence. Lend-Lease had bought survival, yes, but it had also secured America's dominance and Britain's subordination. The empire could celebrate military victories, but the strategic game had already been lost. And this brings us to the critical realization. Wars are fought on multiple fronts. Britain won battles and campaigns. But in terms of global finance, sovereignty, and long-term strategic positioning, it had been outmaneuvered. Lend-Lease had been the tool of that quiet conquest, a transaction framed as aid, but functioning as leverage, reshaping empires without artillery, diplomacy, or overt coercion. By the end of this period, the pattern was clear. Victory in war does not guarantee freedom and peace. Britain survived physically, militarily, and politically, but its ability to shape the world according to its own vision was permanently compromised. The battlefield of finance, once ignored, had determined the future of the empire, and the story of Lend-Lease serves as a blueprint for how power can shift invisibly, quietly, and permanently, long after the last gun is fired. By the 1970s, the final consequences of Britain's wartime financial dependence were unmistakable. The empire was no longer a global power in the traditional sense. Former colonies were independent. Trade was largely dictated by global market forces, and the pound had been permanently eclipsed by the dollar. What had once been an unshakable network of economic and political influence had been replaced by a more modest role. Important, yes, but subordinate to American priorities. Even in Europe, Britain's influence was curtailed. Economic recovery and integration were largely shaped by American-designed institutions. Britain participated in NATO and other alliances, but policy choices were constrained by financial realities and the need to maintain favorable relations with Washington. The strategic autonomy that the empire had long relied upon was gone. Lend-Lease had been the turning point, establishing a new hierarchy before the war had even ended. The domestic impact persisted as well. Britain faced slow growth, industrial decline, and the lingering effects of debt. Public services improved gradually, but resources were always limited by obligations to external creditors. Ordinary citizens experienced the long-term consequences of decisions made decades earlier under wartime duress. Paying and rationing reduced economic opportunity and constrained government services. Internationally, the dollar's dominance solidified. New York emerged as a financial epicenter, and global markets revolved around American institutions. Britain's centuries-old role as the center of trade and finance was permanently altered. The narrative of wartime heroism obscured this transformation, but the reality was clear. Britain had ceded economic power without losing a single battle in the traditional sense. Lend-Lease had done more than supply weapons. It had rewritten the rules of global influence. The lesson is sobering. Military victory, while essential for survival, is not synonymous with strategic independence. Britain had survived the existential threat of World War II, yet the empire that emerged was weaker, financially tethered, and increasingly dependent on an ally that was becoming the dominant global power. Lend-Lease had ensured survival in the short term, but imposed structural constraints that would shape British policy and global influence for generations. And yet, the narrative persisted that Britain had won the war. The parades, monuments, and celebrations emphasized courage and sacrifice. The invisible economic conquest remained largely unspoken. People cheered while the empire's financial autonomy quietly eroded. The real battle had been fought in banks, boardrooms, and balance sheets, and Britain had lost. Lend-Lease also provided a blueprint for modern economic influence. The United States demonstrated that financial leverage, conditional aid, and strategic lending could achieve long-term objectives without traditional conquest. Countries that depended on American loans, resources, or aid would often have to accept American economic and political terms. Britain was the first and most consequential example. Its dependence became the template for how financial power could supplant military dominance. By the end of the 20th century, Britain had fully repaid its wartime debts. Yet the geopolitical landscape had shifted irreversibly. America was a dominant superpower. Former colonies were independent. And London's role in global finance had been permanently diminished. Lend-Lease had bought survival, yes, but at the cost of influence, autonomy, and long-term strategic freedom. The empire that had dominated the world for centuries had survived its last war only to find that the rules had changed forever. This is the true story of Lend-Lease, a wartime aid program framed as generosity, but functioning as a tool of strategic control. Britain received the weapons and supplies it desperately needed, but it paid with influence, autonomy, and long-term economic freedom. Military victory was secured, but financial sovereignty was surrendered, and that is the hidden truth most histories never fully acknowledge. Victory in battle does not always mean victory in power. Britain's guns were victorious, but its ledgers told a different story. Lend-Lease reshaped the modern world, shifted the center of power to America, and demonstrated that in the 20th century, finance could achieve what armies alone could not. The empire survived, but was no longer master of its own destiny. And the lesson echoes today. The real power lies not just on battlefields, but in balance sheets, contracts, and the invisible levers of global finance.